I know you guys hungry, so I'll be quick. Before I start the actual presentation, let me just address some concerns expressed yesterday. The situation with younger generations is not that bad. We could listen to Paulina, and we heard gentlemen from Białystok with all the initiatives in Białystok. So there are many internet forums and blogs talking about history and about Kresy. I might not be very young, but I have no connections to Kresy, and yet here I am. My roots are in Wielkopolska and Małopolska, but I grew up in Wrocław, and that's where I got exposed to Kresy. My next door neighbor's father was killed in cutting. Another neighbor came from Lviv, and I loved listening to her accent. Then I met more people in London, people from Kresy, and people who were sent to Siberia. And then I found Kresy Siberia, where I'm trying to get involved as much as possible. So don't worry, there's hope. People will not forget. But now, back to my presentation. I write a blog called Polish Traces Around the World, Śladami Polaków dookoła świata. I have two big passions, traveling and history. So a few years ago, I've decided to combine them, and here's the result. Because of our history, one can find Poles on every continent, and my search of Polish traces have taken me to 3 continents already. I'm going to tell you about a few places where our compatriots ended up because of the World War II. When in 2016, I got a chance of joining a group of Swedish politicians going to Kenya and Tanzania, I knew that I have to use the opportunity. As we know, over 40,000 civilians left Soviet Union with Anders' army in 1942. Something had to be done about them, as they couldn't stay in Iran. Around 18,000 of them were sent to East and South Africa, where in total 22 camps were set up for them. As I was landing in Arusha in Tanzania, I knew I had to visit the site of the biggest one of them in Tengeru. Every description of Tengeru I read always mentioned Kilimanjaro and Mount Meru, so I was trying to spot them when I flight from Nairobi. And as you can see, they do look majestic, as the Kilimanjaro on the left, Mount Meru on the right, and that's how Mount Meru looks from Arusha. Approximately 5,000 Poles lived in Tengeru. For comparison, only around 2,000 Europeans lived in Nairobi at the time. The camp was around 400 hectares big and was located on the territories inhabited by the Maasai tribe. The site of the camp had been cleared up and new cabins were built just a few days before the arrival of the first refugees. First transport arrived in Tengeru on 9th of October 1942. Huts were mostly circular with a diameter of about 5 meters. The walls made of clay were whitewashed with a conical roof covered with banana, palm leaves or grass, some of them with wooden doors. Windows with wooden shutters and floors made of dirt. One house was designed for one family and came with simple equipment like bed, mattress, table with chairs, cutlery, etc. Although it might sound primitive, it satisfied all the basic needs. Pretty soon huts were surrounded by beautiful gardens. The camp was very well organized with British commander and Polish administration. There was a farm and workshops, hospital, orphanage, schools and playrooms. Polish newspapers were printed mostly in Nairobi, supplying refugees with news, both local and from Europe. News were also getting to refugees via radio and mail. That's how a hut in Tengeru looked like. Those of you who saw Jonathan's film yesterday could see more images from from Tengeru. He is here today. I actually had a pleasure of meeting him in London in 2016. He was fresh after visiting Tengeru, and he gave me lots of tips, so thank you very much. Unfortunately, the site of the old Polish settlement now lay within the grounds of a large agricultural college, but a place I really wanted to see was the Polish cemetery. With such a big camp and after what people went through, it was only a matter of time before there was a need for a cemetery. The first person to be buried, Michał Tchórz, died on 23rd of October 1942, so only 2 weeks after the arrival. And the last person, Edward Wojtowicz, died on the 18th of March 2015. In total, 150 Poles lie in the cemetery in Tengeru. A local man, Simon, lives nearby, and he came as soon as he heard our car. It felt strange and good at the same time to hear Dzień dobry. Somewhere in the middle of Africa. Simon's been looking after the cemetery for almost 20 years now. Before that, his father was doing it. After letting us to the cemetery, he showed us the guest book and various publications and told us about the visits to the cemetery. Nowadays, there's more interest from our government. However, that was not the case before 1989. Simon, we could see it yesterday, he is a very nice man. He knows a few words in Polish, and he told me that he would like his children to study in Poland. I must say that walking around the cemetery and reading the names on gravestones was an unforgettable experience. It's peaceful and beautiful out there. However, it is heartbreaking to think how far from home they were buried. A few pictures from the cemetery. As you can see, it does look nice. Pretty much all the graves are in a good condition. But of course, Africa, actually, there's more. After visiting Arusha, I went to Simanjiro, where I spent 5 days in Maasai village. Many people who stayed in one of the settlements in Africa quite often call Africa the second home. And I think one of the reasons for that is Maasai hospitality. Every boma I visited, there was always food, sodas, and a lovely tea ready waiting for us. We were given best seats and we always felt special. We have a saying in Poland, gość w dom, Bóg w dom, and that's how it felt. I haven't seen such hospitality anywhere else in the world. It did feel like being home. But of course, Africa was not the only continent where our civilians were sent during the war. Almost 1,500 of Poles were sent to North America, precisely to Santa Rosa, near León in Mexico. The idea came from Brits. Initially, the plan was to send 20,000 Poles to Guatemala and 4,000 to Mexico, as long as Central American governments wouldn't have to pay for Polish refugees. Due to logistical issues, the number of Polish refugees that would move to Mexico was lowered to 10,000 people. Unfortunately, there was no agreement with Guatemalan government. Hacienda Santa Rosa was chosen as the best location. A few buildings were standing, but they were in a bad shape, so they had to be renovated. That's how it looked like during the war. I've mentioned the logistical issues. Shortage of troop ships was the issue, and that led to only less than 1,500 Poles being sent from Karachi in 2 transports. In both cases, USS Hermitage was the carrier for them. On the way to USA with the first transport, the ship stopped in Wellington, New Zealand. This short visit resulted in New Zealand's government inviting Polish children to come and stay until the end of the war. The transport of 838 Poles from Iran, mostly orphans and half-orphans, arrived in Wellington on 1st of November 1944. But that is another story. So this is USS Hermitage, confiscated by Americans from Italians. Both transports arrived in Santa Rosa in 1943. First one in the summer and the second one in the autumn. Half of the colony's population were children and teenagers. So even though the school building was not ready yet, the youngsters began their education outdoors and in the corridors. It's a picture of second transport arriving in Santa Rosa in November of 1943. And a lesson in the corridor. I allowed myself to paraphrase Sir Winston Churchill. Just like Tengeru and many other Polish settlements in Africa, Santa Rosa was very well organized, with schools, library, orphanage, farm, etc. Later on, the Felician sisters arrived in the colony to look after the orphans and to teach. There was a weekly magazine called Polak w Mexico, a Pole in Mexico, that was published in Santa Rosa. Another source of news were letters from Europe. When it became clear that Sybiracy won't have a place in Poland after the war, more attention was given to teaching children Spanish and English. Mexico was the first country in Latin America to withdraw support to the Polish government in London. That happened on 9 of July 1945, which meant that Poles had to look for a new place to live. Only around 150 people decided to return to Poland. The rest moved to other countries, mostly to USA. In 2014, I was traveling around Mexico, and when I got to Guadalajara, Santa Rosa was almost just around the corner. There wasn't a lot of information available on the internet, but I asked for help Joanna Matias, whose father was born in Santa Rosa. For those who speak Polish, I recommend her book. It's beautifully written. I managed to find the address online, and I took a cab from Leon's bus station. The driver managed to find it, and he waited for me while I strolled around the hacienda. There's an orphanage now, so there was a lot of kids running around, shouting hello, and photobombing almost every attempt of taking a picture. But that only added to my experience. 70 years earlier, Polish children were doing exactly the same thing. However, photobombing is a pretty new thing, I believe. Let's have a look at a few pictures from Santa Rosa today. There's a chapel. Apparently it looked much better during the war. There were gardens, and now it looks a bit dry. I'm going to finish with a story of another group of Polish exiles. This group did not go through the hell of Siberia, however. They were faced with the same dilemma after the war. Shall we go back to Poland or not? I moved to Sweden last year. It was because I followed my heart. My wife is Swedish. She comes from a small town called Mariefred. And believe me, apart from visiting crowds during the summer, this is probably the quietest place in Sweden. And yet there are surprisingly many Polish traces which lead me to conclusion that our marriage was just meant to be. One of the main tourist attractions is the Gripsholms Castle, where Polish King Zygmunt III Waza was born. But I'm not going to tell you about the tourist attractions. In September 1939, 3 of our submarines Semp, Žbík and Riš, ended up in Sweden, which was a neutral country. The submarines were disarmed and 170 of our seamen were interned in Mariefred. I think that cemeteries tell you the history of the place. Imagine my surprise when I first went to the Mariefred cemetery and found graves with Polish names. There's also a monument commemorating our sailors. And all of this one can find in the center of the town. There's in total 17 Polish sailors buried in Mariefred. This is a commemorative plaque at the entrance of Mariefred Cemetery, funded by the Polish government in 2004. It's in a town called Mariefred in Sweden. And this is a Polish sailors, a monument to Polish sailors unveiled by the Polish People's Republic. Every time I visit the place, I light a candle. This is a grave of seaman Władysław Słoma, one of few Poles who stayed in Mariefred after the war. It was his initiative to found a monument at Marielund station in Mariefred, where the camp was located during the war. It was also his idea to run an old steam train from Mariefred to Legesta via Marielund. It is a very popular tourist attraction in the summer. He also organized an exhibition about Polish submarines in Vaxholm Fortress near Stockholm and a few smaller ones in southern Sweden. And this is a grave of seaman apprentice Stanisław Terlecki. My wife went to school with his granddaughter. First winter in Sweden, sailors spent in Stockholm. The submarines were rearmed after the invasion of Denmark and Norway, as Swedes were afraid that Germans would attack Sweden as well. That didn't happen, and in summer of 1940, the boats and sailors were moved to Mariefred at the Mälaren Lake. Initially, the officers lived on the tourist ship, and later they moved to a villa. In 1943, barracks were built for the sailors, but before that they slept on two old barges. The temperatures during the winter were dropping to minus 35 degrees. Living conditions led to 4 Polish sailors dying before the end of the war. The interned sailors did not need any financial help from Swedish government. Polish government deposited before the war in the Swedish bank Handelsbanken money to buy Bofors cannons. This, plus deposits from the submarines, was used to cover the expenses. On top of that, the Polish sailors were helping out farmers around Mariefred, earning some pocket money. There's only a meadow now where the Polish sailors' barracks were used to stand. The dirt road on the right is called Ubåtsstigen, the submarine path. The laundry and bath shack is still standing. This is where Polish sailors wash themselves and their clothes. I guess it did take some time for almost 200 men to wash. I still need to work on my editing skills, but the Red Cross marks the tiny Skalarholmen Peninsula. Behind that cross, Semp, Žbík and Riš were moored during the war. This is a tiny Marielund station building, and the monument next to it mark the spot where the camp was located. It's also a stop on the tourist trains route, and this is the monument founded by Władysław Słoma. When the war ended, only 1 out of 16 officers decided to go back to Poland. The rest followed the usual routes: USA, Canada, Australia, etc. 75 sailors decided to stay in Sweden, many of them in Mariefred, many of them marrying Swedish women, so I guess I just follow the trend. Apart from the fact that some of the Polish sailors stayed there and started families, the camp was a big thing for the local community. The town's population during the war was approximately 1,500 inhabitants, and suddenly 170 foreign men became their neighbors with their own strange culture and language. I spoke to one older gentleman in Mariefred last summer, and he still remembers how town people were keen to see the Poles, how young women wanted to meet the handsome sailors. It was a bit of shock to the community, a positive shock. Trust me, if it wasn't for the lunch break, I could talk about Poles around the world. Researching similar stories gave me a lot of joy and satisfaction. Last year I started posting every day on a Polish Traces Around the World Facebook page. It's kind of a page from calendar thing, sharing more and less known facts from Polish history, and they actually have been quite popular amongst my readers. So I invite you to check it out. Thank you very much for your attention, and we can start our lunch.
Thank you very much, Marcin. And by the way, let me welcome Marcin aboard to the Zarząd, the Executive Committee of Kresy Siberia Foundation as well. So as he said, he's really putting his life and history into our hands and for us. So thank you very much. So now, we're not doing too bad. It's about 5 minutes past 1 o'clock, so we've caught up, and thank you. Marcin and Paulina is coming back at 3 o'clock. Marcin, you'll come back at 3 for questions and a discussion, yes? So we now have lunch until 2 o'clock. If you please come back at 5 minutes to 2 so that we can start at 2 o'clock, because we have 2 more speakers, Tanya and Amanda, and at 3 o'clock we have questions, and then we're showing a film from Narges and so on, so we have still quite a lot of a program to finish today, and it's all very exciting. So lunch is where it was downstairs. Smacznego. Bon appetit.